content of today's video is on Indian English poetry of the modern phase and is meant for my semester 2 students especially. Along with the intention of providing the necessary information, the purpose of today's video is to grow a proper critical understanding of the post-independence poetry as a genre separate from the preceding phase of Indian poetry, as well as distinct from the genre of prose fiction that dominated the literary domain during the period. So with no further ado, let's begin. In the screen before you, I have divided the title of the genre into its constituent parts: Indian, English, and poetry. Now, Indian is the identity of the poets derived out of the newly formed nation entering into the post-independence phase. English is the language of the colonizer, and as I've already discussed in my previous videos on postcolonial literature, it is also a language which has an ambivalent relation as well as position in the postcolonial nations. Finally, poetry is often defined as spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Hence, as you can understand, I assume that the very name of the category narrates a tension inherent in it, especially because the genre is poetry, which is associated with subjectivity, emotions, and hence the unsaid verdict goes that mother tongue would have effectively complemented the genre. So in the post-independence era, there were conflicting attitudes in context of the genre. In the socio-cultural premise, Angrezi Hatao, remove English movement was going on, and hence the reception was not as satisfying as it should have been. Even as late as in the year 1963, the famous Bengali poet and writer Buddhadev Bose remarks about Indian English poetry as being a blind alley lined with curio shops leading nowhere. But well, in the year 1952, Ezekiel's A Time to Change gets published from Fortune Press in England, which is definitely a landmark in the history of post-independence Indian English poetry, for the publication heralded modernism in Indian English poetry. The fact that it gets published from England clearly testimonies that the genre was still not popular in India, and the name to which Indian English literature is indebted for he played an important role in flowering as well as in growing acceptance of Indian English poetry is P. Lal, Purushottam Lal. In the year 1947, P. Lal publishes In Defense of Modern English Poetry, and post-publication of Ezekiel's book, reviews the book for the magazine Thought. He was a poet himself, and two moves of which he was a part changed the scenario. The first is the publication of the anthology titled Modern Indo-Anglian Poetry in the year 1957. The anthology was jointly edited by K. Raghavendra Rao and P. Lal, and this anthology became a virtual manifesto for a new kind of poetry in which the English language would be twisted and tortured to become a fit medium for poetry that could represent faithfully an Indian sensibility. In the introduction to the manifesto, P. Lal, by extracting a passage from Aurobindo, refers to the same as greasy, weak-spined and purple adjective spiritual poetry, and clearly presents his intention of marking a break from the tradition of Aurobindo through the anthology. With the publication of poems by Dom Morris, Nissim Ezekiel, he intends to leave behind the tradition of imitation, romanticism, propaganda, and initiates a move towards private voice in poetry, experimentation, precise experience, whether intellectual, historical, or emotional, but expressed lucidly in a language that must not be a total travesty of the current pattern of speech. In the screen, you can see P. Lal's opinion about language. A vital language may be in modern idiom or ancient, but it must not be a total travesty of the current pattern of speech. We consider all expressions like the sunlight sweet, deep booming voice, and fragrant flowers upon the distant lea to be ridiculous. King's and Queen's English, yes. Indian English, permissible. Pidgin, bombastic and gluey English, no. Let me explain this with an example. The extract on the left that you can see is from Aurobindo's Savitri. The language here, if you can see, is different from the language that we use. Pain is the hammer of the gods to break, a dead resistance in the mortal's heart, his slow inertia as of living stone. This kind of language and the flowery romanticism is what P. Lal rejected. Instead of such bombastic English, the preference was for, say for instance, the sharp-edged nature of Indian verse that we get to see in A.K. Malhotra. You can see in the right is a extract from A.K. Malhotra. Leaning out over a lantana bush, a bloom with polybags, yellow and pink, and a woman gathering firewood beside a sluggish gutter, while her twitchy goats go looking for a patch to graze on, is the big cluster fig, its giant's foot, its buttress roots, caught in the rusted door of the garden shade. Read and listen how the words enter our Indian ears with a kind of ease. Thus, P. Lal was speaking of appropriation and not merely imitation, as was to be found in the poems of Sarojini Naidu, Toru Dutt or Aurobindo. The second move is the establishing of writers' workshop in the year 1958 with, quote-unquote, when no one would publish our work, we had to do it ourselves, as the underlying thought behind it. The writers' workshop initiated two kinds of revolt. The first was revolt within the inherited tradition of English poetry written in India, that is, a rebel against giants who used their excellence tyrannously and thereby deaden healthy growth. This is evident from the discussion that I did few moments back about language and the break that the anthology initiated. The second revolt was against those who discredited creative writing in English by Indians. I'd like to quote in this context from the Indian Express. In a recent tribute to the poet P. Lal, in the article Remembering P. Lal and Writers' Workshop, the original publishing house for the new authors, this lines occurred. A significant part of Lal's defense is also in pursuing his readers to appreciate poetry for its own sake. I am not reading poetry for spiritual propaganda or propaganda of any sort, whether it plugs aspirin or bhakti. Building this secular identity for poetry is something we take for granted, but it was a struggle to make readers aware of that identity in newly independent secular India. So you can see P. Lal opened the secular space both as writing method and a reading position into Indian English poetry, and the emphasis was shifted from language towards the essence of poetry. Having discussed the anthology and the writer's workshop, now I would like to move into the second part of the discussion, that is, the poets and the feature of Indian English poetry of the modern phase. The second section is not a disconnected section but follows from the first. The poets who dominated the modern phase were Nissim Ezekiel, Kamala Das, Dom Morris, P.K. Shaha, A.K. Ramanujan, Gif Patel, etc. In general, about the poets, I'd like to point two things. For many of them, English was the language they were comfortable in. As for instance, Jasawala says, I don't know poetry in any other language. The second is the mental world of the poets were bilingual. That is, their habits and thoughts were rooted in things Indian, but with a greater facility of expression in English. In this context, I would like to refer to the magazine Poetry India, which was born out of the creative synergy between Marathi and English by Nissim Ezekiel. Thus, the poets had a background facilitating writing in English, and they also had a socio-cultural location which added to the diversity of the genre. The poets were from various locations. Say for instance, Kamala Das was from Kerala, Gif Patel, Nissim Ezekiel were born and brought up in Mumbai, Agha Shahid Ali was from Kashmir, and hence the poetic flowering cannot be considered as a homogeneous product, but broadly speaking, certain common tendencies could be noticed. So now it's time to sum up the features. In the screen, you can see the basic common features. Number 1, a rejection of old style of poetry influenced by English ballad or elegy, discarding of words like whence, hither, thou. The poetry was influenced by European modernism, which also marks its difference in respect to the contemporary prose writers. The metaphoric turning of the poets can be noticed to be towards the self, that is inwards. We can also notice self-distancing poetic lens when it came to community. Say for instance, the image of the scorpion and the story revolving around the scorpion in Ezekiel's Night of the Scorpion aids the self-distancing strategy. Thus, the superstitious, unscientific temperament of the community is indirectly presented without any direct reference or denotation. The sixth point that is to be noted as a feature is the issue of identity that emerges in the metaphoric space of the poet. The issue of identity in the modern phase moves through two planes. The first is the hyphenated identity as bearers of two cultural streams, the Indian and the English. Thus, when Kamala Das is writing in an introduction and confesses about writing in two languages and about her English as half Indian and half funny, she is trying to come into terms through the poetic persona with the hyphenated identity. The second is the issue of identity and self as prevailing in European modernist literature, where the individual feels alienated from the community and yet perceives through a heightened and intensive consciousness the world around him. Say for instance, when Agha Said Ali writes, "She only said, the monsoons never cross the mountains into Kashmir." In the poem, The Seasons of the Plain, both identity and alienation is depicted. In women writers, the same attempt was often seen as disrupting and threatening to the notion of nation and family, the kind that we see in Kamala Das, especially in a poem and introduction. So these are the basic features that you need to know in order to understand Indian English poetry of the modern phase and also to appreciate the poems of Ezekiel and Kamala Das that you have in your syllabus. Hope the content of today's video will enable you to understand the poems and their context. I'll share with you some link to some books which will help you to understand the genre and the phase better. Check the description box for the same. So this brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you all for joining me.